Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Sanctuary. I'm your host, Professor C, and I'll be taking us through another A&P study session. Specifically today, we'll be talking about life functions and homeostasis. So, without any further business, let's get right to it. Okay, in this video, we're going to look at life functions, vital necessities to maintain life, and the concept of homeostasis. So let's look through these 8 life functions. Depending on which book you may see or source you may see, you may find a variable number rather than 8. But this is a pretty good list right here. So we would say that what is life? Well, first of all, it has some sort of basis in cells. That is, there's some cellular similarity across the spectrum of life. And then there are some boundaries associated with those structures. We'll see. Life typically moves, although there are many ways to do that. Life tends to respond to a stimulus. If something is too hot for that organism or cell, it usually has some sort of mechanism to deal with that. Metabolism is a word that refers to chemistry happening inside of the cell. Growth, something getting larger. Reproduction, something becoming more than just one thing. Excretion, getting rid of wastes. And then, of course, the end of life is, unfortunately, the end. Okay, let's look at them one at a time. So all cells, even though there are many different types across the spectrum of life, all cells share some similarities. So I can see some structures here that we can label. There's that outside of a cell. We call that a membrane. I see a structure we've seen before, I believe. The nucleus of this cell. And then we see these little machines called organelles. And we talked about this in the hierarchy of life, and we'll be getting to them more. But even though we can't make a statement that all cells across all life have all these structures, there are some similarities in that they have some sort of boundary between what is them and what is not them, right? The difference between a cell and what is not the cell. In this case, it would be a membrane. And we've seen that term. It could be something larger, like your skin around your body is definitely a separation, a boundary between the external and internal environments. So cells across all life, even though there's a lot of variety, do share similar traits. Movement is a pretty easy thing to understand. We see a lot of horses here, organisms moving. I could have shown people running, or really any type of organism on the earth, even plants. Even though they don't run around the field, they certainly do move throughout the day and throughout their lifetimes. So just like you would think, organisms use muscles or some other structure that has a contractility to it to move. For us, we'll be mainly talking about movement of body parts using skeletal muscles, moving substances through our body using things like smooth muscle or cardiac muscle, the muscle we find in the heart. Responsiveness, that is, if an organism can detect a stimulus, not only can it detect it, or we see the word here, sense, not only can it detect that stimulus, but it can respond to it. It can do something about it, right? So I see on the right-hand side of this slide, I see a tree and all the leaves of the tree. And even though it's hard to see when the wind is blowing and when you're walking past a tree, but if you had the ability to observe one in a lab, you would notice that the leaves do sense where the light is. Photo, good root word for light. And they do move toward it. As the sun progresses across the sky, the leaves will tilt and angle so they can get the maximum amount of light. This movement, I see the root taxis. Think about a taxi cab moving you somewhere. So I have a root light photo. I have a root taxis movement. Light movement, it's not the movement of light, but it's the movement because of light. The plant is detecting light and responding to it. Now, this fellow on the left side, who looks like he's about to quite sillily touch a red hot heating element on a stove. Now, if he did this, there would be some kind of immediate withdrawal, right? And again, when you look at things like your heart rate and your breathing rate and your ability to withdraw quickly from pain, these are things outside of your control as a human being. You can't consciously regulate your heart rate. Your brain and other parts of your body are doing that for you. They're responding to certain chemical and physical environment within you. So this fella here that's putting his hand on the hot stove, luckily he doesn't have to, think, wow, this thing is hot. I better move my hand off of this stove before I get all burned and hurt. No, he'll pull back immediately. And he may say something, in fact, like, oh, that was hot, like it's the past tense, right? So the withdrawal reflex. So not only can organisms sense changes in the environment, they can respond to those changes. Big topic here, a difficult topic. Yes, the figure is a little bit blurry. Yeah, I don't really care that we know all the details here, but we're going to keep this simple, right? That's the idea here. If you wanted to define metabolism, you could easily come up with this right here. The total, the sum of all the chemistry that's going on in some system, whether it be an entire body, like you and your trillions of cells, or whether you're just studying one particular metabolism in one particular organ or metabolism in one particular cell in a single-celled organism. Okay, you often hear during a discussion about metabolism this talk about respiration and some type of energy exchange. This is all true, which makes the topic very complicated. But in general, we're talking about building and breaking things down. And we saw way back in our previous talk about when we go like from the atomic level up to the molecular level, then up to the cellular level, how we're just increasing complexity here. So at some point we need to be able to, within a cell, break things apart and rebuild them into the things that we need. And this can be discussed usually as these two words right here, catabolism and anabolism, two different forms of metabolism. Okay, let's try to draw this real quick. If I were to take some sort of long molecule held together by some bonds, and we can illustrate it like this, I would call that a polymer. A word that really just simply means many things or many units strung together. And I could take those inside of a cell and I could break them down. And just think, if you're having trouble keeping them straight, which ones break and which ones build. Cats tear things up. Just picture that in your mind, a cat shredding a piece of paper or something, and you see the cat tearing it apart. So catabolism is breaking apart something. And of course you'd be breaking it into these individual pieces, these mers, right? We had polymer was many thingies. Single thingies would be called monomers, one thingy. And again, when we get to the discussion later in detail, we'll see what happens and how we do this in detail. But the point is, we want to take these monomers and rebuild them into your own body parts that your cell needs to survive. This other side where we rebuild, we take those pieces that we've broken down and rebuild them into something we need. This is called anabolism. Anabolism. Building. A trick you could use is to say an anabolic steroid builds you up. It's a stretch, but it works. So cats tear things up. Catabolism breaks. Anabolic reactions build things up, just like an anabolic steroid would build you up and make you look stronger. Okay, growth and reproduction. Life exhibits growth, and they may sound similar, and they usually happen together or near each other. but there is a distinction. Growth, it explicitly means something getting larger, an increase in size. That's the only term growth refers to. Reproduction refers to something increasing in numbers or increasing in population. So here's a term you'll see if you continue the lecture series, mitosis, the idea that cells divide. And you kind of see that in this image in the background. It looks like those cells used to be one, and it looks like they're pinching off in the middle and on their way to becoming two, right? So you could think this is a reproduction in a cellular level, cells multiplying like in your skin to create more skin cells. Or you could think about it as, an entire organism reproducing and making more organisms, creating what we call offspring, which is an increase in number. So growth, increase in size; reproduction, increase in number. Growth is get bigger, reproduction is make more. Excretion, very simply, every time you do metabolism, you get some sort of product that maybe you don't want to use in another way. We call these waste products, right? So you can get these from digestion, from respiration, from many, many metabolic pathways produce some sort of waste product. And we must get rid of this or cells can become damaged organs and so forth. So things like urea, carbon dioxide, urine, sweat, feces, these are all things that need to be removed from the body. And we do this through excretion. All life does it in some way. We humans have a very complicated way of dealing with this, but we'll see that later. Unfortunately, the last one is some sort of definite lifespan. All life does stop living. We call this term senescence. It's a nice way to say it, but it is unfortunately the shared fate of all living things that they will not live eternally here on this earth. Okay, now that we dealt with that, let's deal with these 5 vital needs. Again, this is done in some sort of variety across the spectrum, but these are the most common things you see. Nutrients, aka food. I think that's a no-brainer. Organisms need food in some form or fashion. Oxygen is strange because, as we'll see, we need it definitely. This frog over here needs it, and so on, but some organisms don't, but we'll get into that. We definitely do, though. Water, of course, very important when it comes to chemistry. We need water present. Temperatures need to be kept, around a certain range, and pressures need to be kept around a certain range. So what does an organism need to survive? It needs these to be maintained at some particular level or range. Let's look through them one at a time very briefly. Nutrients, of course, food. So food, as we saw, as we break it apart using catabolism, we can get monomers. We can get the components to build cellular structures. We can also release energy as we do this, and this energy can be harvested and shuttled around a cell and used to build things later on. Now, it's all very complicated, of course. You can take entire courses in college that have to do only with nutrition, right? So things like carbs and fats, which we'll call lipids mostly in these discussions, proteins and so on. These components that you need come from your food. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about vitamins and minerals and some other things you get in small amounts, but I think we all know what food is and why it's important. Oxygen, as I made the point, you in a large multicellular, right, many cellular, made of cells, multicellular organism. Remember, like 40 trillion cells or so make up our bodies. That is definitely multicellular. Oxygen is essential. So you've probably heard the term before. I'll put it up here in the sky. An aerobe is not something that needs air, even though it's a very common mistake that you hear. Aerobes require oxygen. And you, being a human being, are an aerobe. Okay, why do we need it? Well, we have to generate some fuel inside of our cells to run them, and that's called ATP. So ATP is the fuel that we put in our cells to run them. And if we've got trillions of cells, we're going to need a lot of ATP, so we probably need a lot of both food and oxygen. We have to remember, just as a side note, that there are many, many unicellular, right, single-celled organisms on this planet, like bacteria, that don't really care about oxygen at all and live fine anaerobically. We won't be mentioning them in this course. We'll be limiting our talk to humans. Water, water everywhere. Why do they look for water on other planets when they go out looking for life? It's very simple. There's a reason why it's the most abundant body in a molecule in your body. There's a reason why it's the most abundant molecule across the spectrum of life. It runs metabolism. Water runs metabolism. If you want to break substances down, polymers, and turn them into monomers, it takes water to do that. If you want to take those monomers and make them into polymers later, that takes water to do that. Okay, nothing really fancy here. The point is, we have a body temperature. Usually you see it around 37. You see that in the text over on the left-hand side. I know if you're used to using Fahrenheit, you say, 98.6, but oftentimes on exams, they'll use the number 37, 38, somewhere right around 37. But you could use a Fahrenheit temperature if you wanted to. The point is, if I took your temperature right now, you probably wouldn't have exactly 37 degree body temperature. It would fluctuate. It goes up during the day, goes down and up and down. You're sleeping, it goes up, it goes down. But there is a range, and that's the point here. We're getting into this idea of a balance. There's some way to balance these vital necessities, right? So we need a temperature. We don't have to keep it exact, but we need to keep it close. We need to keep it in some sort of narrow range to ensure we get perfect cellular function. Same is true with pressures. No long story here. Air pressures from breathing, blood pressure from the heart pumping, osmotic pressures from particles like salts in the blood and sugars in the blood. All these have to be maintained or things get unbalanced. And this can lead to what we call problems or illnesses or diseases. Okay, so the really important part of this discussion is, how does your body or your cells, how do they balance all of these vital needs and these things we talk about? We have to have this and we have to have that, but it's got to be in this level and it has to be within this range. And how do you do this? Well, there's a fancy word called homeostasis. Homeo is very similar to the word homo, meaning same, right? And stasis, again, could refer to static, like stay still. So often you hear this translated as a steady state. I'll try to write that right here. A steady state. It's not maybe a perfect translation to that, but it works. It works. Think of it as two kids on a seesaw, right? Homeostasis, the steady state, represents a dynamic. And again, dynamic means changing. Changing. Like the two kids on the seesaw. Sometimes this girl here, sometimes she's lower than the other. Sometimes she's higher, but they all balance around a midpoint, right? This midpoint being an equilibrium. So there is an equilibrium, there is a steady state, but it does fluctuate slightly around some set point. And if there is, and there are many of these requirements for a cell to function normally and healthily, you must have some kind of, it says here, mechanism with which to control these homeostatic events. So we need some way to monitor, stabilize, regulate, keep our environment balanced. No matter how much the external environment is trying to take us out, we have these homeostatic control mechanisms to fight it off as long as we can. As usual, thanks for watching. If you want, check out the other videos in the series. See you next time. Bye-bye.